In the previous video, we used the rect function to make rectangles and squares. So we're going to learn another new shape function now, but we're actually going to start with what looks like the analogies portion of a standardized test. I'm going to say square is to rectangle as circle is to blank. So what would go here? What is sort of the rectangle version of a circle? If you guessed oval, you're close. That's the right idea, but that's not really the mathematical term. The mathematical term is ellipse. Gold star to you if you actually knew the mathematical term ellipse. So we're going to use the function is ellipse to make circles and ellipses. So I'm going to start out as usual with a size function, 500 pixels wide by 500 pixels high, and a background, 255. It's just a shortcut for white, which we'll go over next week, how 255 becomes white. And now we'll use the ellipse function. So the ellipse function, much like the rect function, takes 4 parameters: an x-coordinate, a y-coordinate, a width, and a height in that order. But unlike the rectangle, the x-coordinate and the y-coordinate are not the upper left-hand corner because an ellipse doesn't have an upper left-hand corner. So the x and the y coordinates of an ellipse in this function are actually the center of the ellipse, which is, I think, actually stands a lot to reason. It's maybe even a bit easier to remember. So if I'm going to make an ellipse in the center of the screen, I'll put it at 250, 250. So the center of the ellipse will be in the center of the screen. Let's make it 200 pixels wide and 100 pixels high to be kind of like a wide but not too tall ellipse. The same style functions apply to ellipse. So I would use fill in the color selector to Command V to paste to give that ellipse a color. If I wanted to change the color of the outline, I could use the stroke function. If I wanted to take away the outline altogether, I would use no stroke. Much like you can use the rect function to make rectangles and squares, you can use the ellipse function to make ellipses and something that, well, it's a very close approximation of a circle for our intents and purposes. So if you make an ellipse, maybe I'll center it at 100, 100. If you give it a width and a height that are the same, it will look very much like a circle. Two other last things to consider here. One is sometimes it's tricky to remember that the x and y of a rectangle is the upper left-hand corner, and the x and y of an ellipse is the center of the ellipse. So if I were to put a rectangle, here I'm going to change this to rect at 100 and 100. That's the upper left-hand corner, 50 by 50, the width and the height. So if I want to put an ellipse inside, perfectly inside that square of 50 pixels wide, 50 pixels high, I have to consider where this upper left-hand corner is and where the center of the ellipse would be as a result. So I'm going to change the color, pick a different fill so we can see it. Command V to paste that in. And I'm going to think, okay, so if I want to make an ellipse that's also 50 by 50, so a circle that's 50 pixels wide and 50 pixels high, I'm going to want the center in the center of the square. So I have to consider how big the square is to know what this point is. So if this point, horizontally speaking, if it's 100 pixels over, I want this a 50 by 50 ellipse to be centered in the middle of here. I would figure out this, it's 25 more pixels to get to the middle horizontally. So I'd want the center, horizontal center of the ellipse to be 125. Similarly, I'd want, again, this is vertically, this is 100 pixels down. I'd want to go another 25, half the height of the circle, or rather, let's say the radius of the circle. I'd have to add the radius of the circle to get the center of the ellipse there. So I'd center that at 125, make that one 50 by 50. There you go, a circle inside the square. So you have to remember that those x and y, if you're trying to center something or align something, that the x and y coordinates are referring to different places in those shapes. One last thing that's kind of fun that I'll introduce now is the concept of transparency. So right now we've used the fill function to give the shapes color, but we can also add some transparency to the shapes. So in any fill function, after the code that indicates the color, if you add a comma and then you add a number between 0 and 255, where 0 is completely invisible, completely transparent, and 255 is completely solid or opaque, solid obviously being in quotes because we're talking about light. So let's say I'll pick 100 here. Then the fill of those two red shapes will be, it just looks like a paler pink now, but let's change the fill of this blue circle as well. Maybe make it 175, so a little bit more transparent. So now you can kind of see it looks a little bit purple. It's easiest to see if you overlap shapes, so I'm maybe going to overlap some shapes here. So this fill will still apply to any shapes I put below this, so I'm going to say ellipse. Maybe I'll put this one at 225, 250. I'll make it 100 by 100. So now, maybe I'll move this down a little, or up a little bit too, easier to see. So you can see the red, what was red and now looks kind of pink. Ellipse beneath this circle. Let's do another one. Put this at, I don't know, 200. I'll do 275. 200 and make it 100 by 100. And I'll put another fill before this one. Maybe I'll pick something in the green family. And I'll make this one even lighter. I'll say 75, so even closer, even more transparent. And you can see how they overlap each one a little bit. So the transparency function, again, just this write in fill with a comma and then some number between 0 and 255. And again, we're going to discuss this magic number 255 next week and why that is sort of a parameter that we're going to see coming up from time to time. The transparency can also be used with the stroke function. So if you want an outline or a line to have some degree of transparency, it's the same thing. You'd say stroke and then the color and then the degree of transparency you'd want. So that wraps up this tutorial, and you can go on to the next assignment.